All right, so today we're going to be doing a little replacement of coil and spark plug wire. Was going to replace my spark plugs and the whole end came off of this guy. So instead of trying to splice it, got myself a new coil and plug wire. So we'll be looking at how to do that replacement. I like to pull out the tools that we're going to need so they're all ready to go. We need a regular size piece of paper that's for gapping the magnet. A couple of open-ended wrenches. I have a 3/8 inch and a 10 millimeter for taking the negative terminal off my battery. Yours might be incrementally different, but open-ended wrenches, you should be good. I have two different size sockets, a 10 millimeter and a 1/2 inch. A regular Phillips head screwdriver, as well as a Torx T30 screwdriver. You can use a Torx T30 drill bit. You can get at what you need with the drill, that's fine, but it needs to be a T30. The direct replacement part, coil and wire from John Deere. Mine is again the X360 with a Kawasaki motor. That motor model number is FS651V as in Victor. Yours might be different, so make sure you double check with your dealer before you get the part. A couple of zip strips or zip ties so that I can replace ones that get removed for routing tubes and wires. I like to put back what John Deere had originally just to keep things up and out of the way. And a side cutters to cut out the zip strips we do remove if we do. So let's get to it. So the first thing we're going to need to do is remove this plastic housing that covers the motor. There's several different screws and bolts. We'll have to get those taken out, starting with removing the air filter cover and air filter itself. So basically all you need to do for removing the air filter is turn these little knobs counterclockwise and lift this off. There you got your air filter. So you want to take that out as well. We're going to have to remove that so that you can actually pull this all off. So in order to get the filter and the housing off, you need to just back out this threaded clamp, get it loose enough so that you can pull that out. And once that's loosened, all you really need to do is pull it up and tip it just gently. It should come right out. Then we'll move over to the rotating screen over the fan. That you're going to need to have the T30 Torx head. I'm using a Torx head screwdriver. You can also use a bit if you have screws that are kind of tight. But they should back out relatively easily. Once you have your screws removed, you can take that screen right off and make sure you don't drop this little, it's kind of like a washer, but it's connected, so it matches up with those holes. So just make sure you don't forget that. All right, so now you're gonna need your Phillips head screwdriver as well as a 1/2 inch socket. You're working with the fuel pump here. We need to just loosen it from the side of that plastic cover and housing. You really got to be careful and make sure that you keep it in the same position and you don't bend it or get it too out of whack. You want to keep everything as stable as you can. So once we get that loosened up, this plastic cover, we should be able to slip that off and leave that kind of in place. But again, take your 1/2 inch socket and your these two screws. We're going to need to use the Phillips screwdriver. So get those loosened up and take the cover off. You've now backed out those two Phillips head screws and removed the fuel bracket, the fuel line support bracket with those two 1/2 inch bolts. Now what you need to do is loosen the cowl the rest of the way, and there are 6 10 millimeter bolts. So take your 10 millimeter. There's one hidden down right under here. There's one right by the fuel pump, There's one back by the battery. And you've got one that's attached to the oil fill valve. Then you've got the one with the cables there. And then one last one right in there. So like I mentioned, you back these 10mm ones out, but you just got to make sure you can back them out as far as you really can. You don't have to remove them. I recommend not removing them just because these are slotted so you can get this cowl back on and kind of slide it into place. But you definitely want to get to the point where you can see some of the bolt so you can slide the cowl up. So I kind of got it started, but once you get it going, you should be able to just pick it right up and off. Now again, be very careful to keep your fuel pump and all those lines as stable as you can. So when you're working on anything to do with the electrical, and these are, they do have a current, of course, so you can get the spark. Remove the negative terminal, get that out of the way, and just to make sure that everything is dead, so when you're working on it, you don't get any surprises. Now that we have the cowl off, we can see the existing coil with the wire that I have with the boot ripped off. As you'll notice, there's one of those zip ties. I'm going to be cutting that off. Make sure you're very careful when cutting that. You do not want to cut a wire inadvertently or score the insulation or anything like that. So just be very careful clipping that. That right there is the magnet, and we'll be talking about that next. But I am going to carefully remove that zip tie and note its position so we can put it back the way it was. And I'll talk about the magnet shortly. Carefully snipped off that zip tie. And now what we really want to do is, before we loosen any of these 10mm bolts, we're going to take this connector off. Again, just be very gentle. Make sure that you don't bend any of these wires just in case they've gotten brittle. Pop that off, and then we'll go to the next step. So I pulled that off, and I just sort of like stuck it down behind this busted wire just so it was out of the way. And what we want to do is remove this, and obviously just backing out the bolts and pulling it off is no problem. But you also want to just make a note of here is the magnet. And you want to just see how that's going to look when it is lined up with the coil. So you see how there's really very little, if any, gap there. That's really what the piece of paper is for. I'm going to move the magnet back out of the way, but we'll take this old one off and then get ready to put the new one on and gap that. So grab your 10mm socket and take those screws or those bolts right out, and you're in good shape. Once we have those bolts out, this just pulls right off. And really what you're going to want to do is, you see how these are slotted? We want to have that slot as far back to the bolt as possible. Again, we'll be using a piece of paper just to make sure we don't have contact per se, but we'll get the new part, we'll get that loosely bolted on, and we'll go from there. One thing I did want to note too, just if you can see where that the head of that bolt is in relation to the slot, like I mentioned, that is all the way up to the front. So that's how we want to make sure that we put it back. But we'll get it bolted and we'll look at it in place. Make sure when you put this all back that you reroute this wire the same way that it was so that you can zip tie it the same way. Also, it's kind of hard to show holding a phone here, but you get these semi-tight, but not super tight, and you just got to make sure that that is fully slid back so you've got the same gap that you had before. Again, hand tightening is the most probably logical way to do it versus tightening down one side or the other. So you just work it back and slowly get them secured so they are all the way back. So I got a little more light here just so we can see. There is not much of a gap without the magnet. And once you move that magnet, I'm currently looking at the existing one. And you move that, and there's very little gap there. So again, that's where the paper comes in. So what you want to do is take your normal sheet of paper, fold it in half, and I have these bolts pulled all the way back and tightened a bit so that I can put that paper right in there. What I'll do is I'll put the paper in, loosen those just ever so slightly, and then move the magnet in place. And when it adheres to it, lock them down and then pull the paper out. So I've got my paper folded. I've moved the magnet so that it's right in place. If you notice that gap, I'm sorry, the between the two magnet pieces, I got that lined up right with that black center of the coil. And these are now tightened down so that they're pulled all the way back. When I put my piece of paper in here, now I'm gonna loosen these up just ever so slightly so that it grabs the magnet. So now that piece of paper is stuck in there. So what I want to do is tighten them both back up. And once I've tightened those back up, slide the paper back out. So now I should have that fine gap, but I'm going to tighten the rest of the way, make sure they're down snug, and I'll show you that it will clear. So with that paper out and those bolts tightened, you can see the magnet in there. And I apologize if this is a little bit jiggly, trying to do it all with one hand, but if you'll notice, see how that clears? There's no rubbing, but it's perfectly gapped. We should be good to go. So I'll put this connector back on in a zip strip and begin putting things back together. Got our zip strip put back on and the connector. Gave it a couple more little turns to make sure it was tight but not, overly tightened. And we'll do some shimmying on of the cowl now. Make sure when you're putting the cowl on, you direct that spark plug wire down where that little inlay there is, the little bit of a inset, so that the cover will go on properly. Once you make sure all 6 of those bolts are tightened up, go ahead and replace the fuel line bracket, as well as the fuel pump 2 Phillips head screws. So then we will put the air filter back on. It should just tip down in there and seat itself in the rubber hose. Make sure it's seated well, and then use the hand tightening clamp to make sure that's nice and tight. And then we'll be putting on the cover here. Make sure you put this back on between the mesh and this inner piece. So once you have that all put back together, last but not least, you want to make sure and put your new spark plug boot on your plug. Make sure it seats. And then we'll put the negative battery cable back on and we'll turn it over. All right, the moment of truth. I'm gonna have to choke it, I guess, a little second. right, well, thanks for watching. Hopefully got a couple of tips or tricks, and good luck on your project.